It is early morning in a quiet neighborhood called Far Rockaway, tucked along the southern edge of Long Island, New York. The year is 1923, and the sea air moves gently through the streets, carrying with it the faint whisper of the Atlantic. In a modest two-story house on New Broadway, a young boy named Richard Feynman has already woken up. The light at this hour is soft and gray, slowly warming into pale gold as it touches the wooden porches and the small gardens that line the street. Inside the house, everything is still. The boy sits cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom, surrounded by small tools and scraps of wire. He is not playing with ordinary toys. Instead, he is carefully taking apart an old radio, his small fingers moving with a patience that seems unusual for someone so young. Outside the window, a few sparrows begin to chirp, but Richard does not look up. He is already lost in the quiet puzzle of circuits and connections, wondering why the set stopped working the night before. Richard's father, Melville Feynman, was a man who believed deeply in paying attention to the world. He sold work uniforms for a living, but his true gift was the way he talked to his son during their long walks. They would stroll together along the sandy paths near the beach, the wind combing through the dune grasses, the sky stretching wide and open above them. Melville would point to a bird and say, "Look, do you know what that bird is called?" In English, it is a brown-throated thrush. In Portuguese, it is something else. In Italian, yet another name. But when you know all those names, you still know nothing about the bird. What matters is what it does. This gentle lesson, offered under a pale blue sky with the ocean murmuring in the distance, settled deep into Richard's mind like a seed planted in soft earth. He began to see that the world was not a collection of labels, but a living stream of questions, each one opening gently into the next. In the afternoons, when school was over and the neighborhood grew quiet in the drowsy warmth, Richard would drift toward his small laboratory, a corner of his room where he kept batteries, light bulbs, and a soldering iron. Sunlight would fall in a golden rectangle across the wooden floor, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the still air. He would connect wires and watch the filaments glow, a soft orange bloom in the dimness. His sister Joan, just 2 years younger, sometimes sat nearby and watched him work, though she was rarely allowed to touch the delicate instruments. The room smelled faintly of heated metal and the salt breeze that drifted in through the open window. This was a time when a child's curiosity could unfold in silence, without hurry, like a flower opening its petals to the afternoon light. One of the early marvels of his childhood was the way he learned to fix radios. Neighbors began to notice that the quiet Feynman boy could make their silent sets sing again. They would bring their broken radios to his door, and he would accept them calmly, carrying them up to his room as if they were wounded animals in need of care. He did not fix them by following a manual. Instead, he would sit and think, staring at the tubes and wires, his brow furrowed slightly in concentration. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood continued, the distant call of a mother summoning her children home, the soft rumble of a trolley car on the main road. But inside his mind, there was only the logical flow of electrons, a silent river of current that he could trace by intuition alone. When the radio finally crackled to life and a voice or a melody came through, the room seemed to brighten, even though the light had not changed. It was a quiet triumph, a small miracle worked by patience and imagination. The beach near his home was a place of constant discovery for young Richard. In the summer, he would walk barefoot across the cool, damp sand where the waves had just retreated. The sun would set slowly, painting the sky in layers of rose, lavender, and pale orange that reflected on the wet shore like a second sky beneath his feet. He watched sandpipers dart along the waterline, their tiny legs moving with a mechanical precision that fascinated him. He wondered about the tides, about the way the moon could pull the entire ocean toward itself across an immense emptiness. Other children might have built sandcastles or splashed in the waves, but Richard simply observed, storing away the patterns of nature in his memory. The Atlantic horizon stretched endlessly before him, a straight blue line dividing the world into known and unknown, and the sight of it filled him not with fear, but with a profound, peaceful curiosity. As the years passed, the boy grew into a teenager, and his experiments became more ambitious. He built a security alarm for his bedroom door, rigged with wires and a battery, so that he would know if his sister tried to enter. The hallway outside his room was dim, lit by a single bulb that cast long shadows on the floral wallpaper. Late at night, when the house slept and the only sound was the creak of old timbers settling, Richard would sit up reading by a small lamp. The pages he turned were filled with advanced mathematics, equations that danced like black birds across white fields. To him, these symbols were not dry abstractions. They were the secret language of the stars and the waves, the same language spoken by the ocean he loved. The quiet ticking of his clock measured out these hours of solitude, and the world seemed to contract into the warm circle of his reading light. The period of his youth in Far Rockaway ended like a tide going out, slowly and almost imperceptibly. The house on New Broadway, with its worn stairs and the tree outside his window, remained steady, but the boy knew he would soon leave for college. On his last mornings there, he would wake early and watch the sunrise one more time, the light catching the dew on the grass and making each blade glisten. The radio parts on his shelf had gathered a thin film of dust. The beach still breathed in its ancient rhythm, but now he carried its lessons within him, the patience of the waves, the clarity of the salt air, the understanding that every question leads to a deeper, more beautiful question. He was ready to step onto a wider shore, carrying with him the quiet treasure of a childhood spent in loving attention to the world. In the autumn of 1935, a young man with bright eyes and an ever-curious mind arrived at the leafy campus of Princeton University. The trees along the stone pathways were turning gold and crimson, and the air held the crisp, cool scent of fallen leaves. Richard Feynman, now a graduate student in physics, walked through the iron gates with a mixture of awe and determination. The Gothic spires of the old buildings rose against a soft gray sky, their windows catching the pale afternoon light. He was assigned a room in the graduate college, a building modeled after an Oxford college, complete with a tower, a dining hall with dark wooden tables, and corridors that echoed with whispered conversations about philosophy and science. Everywhere he looked, there was a sense of history and deep thought, a quiet hum of intellectual life that seemed embedded in the very stones under his feet. His mentor at Princeton was a gentle man named John Archibald Wheeler, whose office overlooked a quiet courtyard where ivy climbed the brick walls in slow, patient tendrils. Wheeler was a theoretical physicist who saw the universe as a place of profound elegance, and he recognized in the young Feynman a kindred spirit. Their meetings would often last for hours, the afternoon light shifting across the room as they filled the blackboard with equations. Wheeler spoke softly, almost reverently, about the structure of space and time, and Feynman listened with his whole body still, absorbing every word. In this peaceful room, with its smell of chalk dust and old books, a revolutionary idea began to take shape, a new way of understanding how light and matter interact. It was the seed of what would later become quantum electrodynamics, but here, in these early days, it was simply two minds playing with the beautiful possibilities of the universe. Princeton's campus was a world unto itself, a sanctuary of green lawns and ancient elms where time seemed to slow down. Richard would often take long walks between the laboratory and his dormitory, his thoughts drifting through the problems he was trying to solve. The path led past a small lake where swans glided silently on the still water, their white forms reflected perfectly. On Sunday mornings, the bells of the university chapel would ring out across the campus, their notes hanging in the air like a gentle announcement of peace. Even though he was not particularly religious, Richard found comfort in the rhythm of the bells, the way they marked the passage of a day dedicated to thought and discovery. In the evenings, he would sit in a leather armchair in the common room, watching the fire crackle softly in the grate, while other students played chess or read in quiet companionship. During one memorable seminar, Feynman stood before a small audience of professors in a wood-paneled lecture room. The light filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting long rectangles of gold onto the rows of empty seats. Among the listeners were some of the most famous scientists of the age, including Albert Einstein himself, who sat in the front row with a calm, attentive expression. Richard's heart beat steadily as he began to speak, not with bravado, but with the simple clarity of someone who had walked the path of ideas many times in his own mind. He drew diagrams on the blackboard, small arrows and wavy lines that represented particles moving through space and time. The room was silent except for the sound of his chalk tapping against the board and the soft rustle of Einstein shifting in his seat. It was a moment suspended in amber, the old wisdom and the new meeting in a place of mutual respect. The town of Princeton itself, with its colonial-style houses and tree-lined streets, became a comfortable home for Richard during those years. He would sometimes walk down Nassau Street in the early evening, the shop windows glowing warmly in the dusk, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread from a bakery. He had a habit of drumming rhythms on his thighs as he walked, a quiet percussive accompaniment to the thoughts flowing through his head. The locals grew used to seeing this slender man with the intense gaze, who would sometimes stop in the middle of the sidewalk to scribble a note on a scrap of paper before continuing on his way. There was a gentle, unhurried quality to his presence, like someone who was always listening to a distant melody that only he could hear. In his small dormitory room, late at night, Richard indulged in a different kind of experiment. He learned to pick the locks of filing cabinets and desks, not for any dishonest purpose, but simply because he was fascinated by the mechanism, the tiny clicks and tumbles that spoke the language of physical objects. He would sit in the quiet hallway, the only light coming from a small flashlight, and feel the subtle feedback through a thin metal tool. To him, a lock was just another puzzle, a conversation between metal and mind. When the bolt finally slid back with a soft clunk, he felt the same quiet satisfaction he did when solving an equation. The moon outside his window traced a slow arc over the campus roofs, a silent witness to his harmless mischief. As his doctoral work deepened, he found himself thinking more and more about the nature of reality itself. He envisioned particles as moving not just forward in time, but also backward, weaving a tapestry of cause and effect that was far richer than anyone had imagined. These ideas came to him not in dramatic flashes, but during quiet moments, while lying on the grass looking up at the clouds, or sitting on the steps of the mathematics building watching the last light of sunset fade from the sky. The Gothic towers above him stood dark against the deep blue of twilight, and a few early stars began to appear. In these moments of stillness, the mathematics felt less like a discipline and more like a landscape he was exploring, a hidden garden of symmetrical patterns and exquisite logic. Princeton had given him the soil and the climate, and now his mind was blooming in ways that would soon change the course of physics forever. The high desert of New Mexico is a land of vast spaces and tremendous silence. When Richard Feynman first arrived at Los Alamos in 1943, he stepped onto a mesa ringed by distant mountains, their flanks purple in the thin, clear air. The town itself was hastily built, a cluster of wooden buildings and unpaved roads that would become the secret heart of the Manhattan Project. But beyond the barbed wire and the guard posts, the landscape remained timeless and serene. Ponderosa pines grew in quiet groves, their bark glowing orange in the late afternoon light, and the sky arched overhead in an immense blue dome that seemed to hold no cloud, no limit. Despite the gravity of the work being done there, Richard found moments of profound peace in the natural world that surrounded this strange, hidden community. His days were filled with calculations, long hours spent in Spartan laboratories where the light came harsh and white through unadorned windows. But in the evenings, he would often walk alone to the edge of the mesa. The sun would set slowly over the Jemez Mountains, the sky transforming into a canvas of deep orange, red, and violet. The air cooled rapidly, and the scent of sagebrush rose from the ground, a fragrance that seemed to contain the very essence of the West. He would sit on a flat, warm rock and watch the colors change, feeling the day's mental strain ease out of his shoulders. Far below, the Rio Grande was a silver ribbon winding through the canyon, its water catching the last light of the sun. In those moments, the frantic urgency of the war felt distant, almost unreal, as if it belonged to a different world entirely. One of the great quiet joys of his time at Los Alamos was the correspondence he kept with his wife, Arlene. She was in a sanatorium in Albuquerque, not far away, battling tuberculosis. Every few days, Richard would write her a long letter, filling the pages with small observations, gentle jokes, and descriptions of the desert beauty he encountered. He would describe the way the light slanted through the pine needles, or the funny shape of a cloud he had seen that afternoon. The letters were his connection to a life outside the intense bubble of physics, a reminder that love could flourish even in a barren landscape. He would walk to the post office, a small wooden building with a tin roof, and drop the letter into the slot, hearing it land softly on the pile below. The act was a small ritual of hope, a gesture of tenderness amid the impersonal machinery of war. Within the secret city, Richard found ways to preserve his own lightness of spirit. He became famous for his ability to crack safes and filing cabinets, a skill he had first developed at Princeton and now honed to an art form. Late at night, when the offices were empty and the only sounds were the hum of generators and the distant call of a coyote, he would test himself against the combination locks. The beam of his flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the dial and his careful fingers. He was not stealing secrets. He was simply unable to resist a puzzle. The next morning, he would leave a playful note inside the safe to inform its owner that their security had been breached, a gentle mockery that earned him a reputation both maddening and endearing. The moon outside, enormous and silver in the dry desert sky, watched over this harmless mischief with an ancient, indifferent face. The cafeteria at Los Alamos was a large, noisy hall where brilliant minds gathered to eat and argue, but Feynman often sought out quieter corners. He would sit by a window, the steam from his coffee rising slowly, and watch the snow fall on the pines in winter. The flakes came down thick and silent, blanketing the world in a deep hush that softened every edge. Sometimes he would take his plate outside, ignoring the cold, just to eat alone under the vastness of the sky. The air was so sharp and clean it felt like a drink of cold water. In these solitary meals, he would let his mind wander across the physics problems of the day, the equations unfurling in his head like a silent music. The taste of simple food, the cold on his cheeks, and the sight of the white landscape merged into a single, peaceful experience of being alive. On rare free afternoons, Richard would borrow a car and drive down into the canyons of the Rio Grande Valley. The road was a winding dirt track that followed the contours of the hills, and the car would kick up a gentle plume of dust that hung in the air behind him like a ghost. He would park near a creek where cottonwood trees grew thick, their leaves shivering in the breeze with a sound like gentle rain. He would walk to the water's edge and watch the current slide over smooth stones, each pebble a distinct color: rust red, pale green, dark blue. The natural world was an engine of ceaseless, patient activity, entirely unaware of the human drama unfolding on the mesa above. Here, in the dappled shade, he could forget the theories for a while and simply exist, a man among trees and water, breathing the cool scent of moss and wet earth. When the first test of the atomic bomb approached, the pace of work intensified, but even then Richard sought a scrap of quiet understanding. On the night of the Trinity test, he sat in the back of a truck, refusing the dark goggles others were wearing, and instead looked at the explosion through the windshield of a Jeep, reasoning that the glass would block the harmful ultraviolet light. When the flash came, it was not a bang but a silent, expanding light that turned the desert into stark day. He watched the white ball grow and then slowly dim, the shadows stretching and retreating. What he felt in that moment was not triumph but a profound, solemn awe, the same feeling he had when contemplating the equations of the universe. The desert returned to darkness, the stars came back out one by one, and the silence that followed was deeper than any he had known before. Years later, when he remembered Los Alamos, it was not the work that came to mind first, but the landscape. The gentle arcs of the pinyon-covered hills, the smell of pine on a hot afternoon, the wide, welcoming expanse of the New Mexico sky. He remembered driving home at dusk, the roads stretching ahead empty and straight, the radio playing a faint mariachi tune that drifted in and out of static. The mesas stood like ancient sentinels on the horizon, their flat tops silhouetted against a glowing sky. In that memory, the whole experience became something almost tender, a time of terrible purpose and unexpected beauty, held in balance under the watchful eye of the desert. After the war ended, the world seemed to open up again like a great door swinging wide onto a fresh morning. Richard Feynman found himself at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, a town of steep hills and deep gorges where waterfalls cut through the rock in the very center of the city. From his office window in the physics building, he could see the trees of the campus sloping down toward Cayuga Lake, a long, finger-shaped body of water that gleamed like silver in the early sun. The air here was cool and damp, often filled with the mist that rose from the gorges, and the sound of the waterfalls was a constant, gentle thunder in the background. In this environment of natural beauty and academic quiet, Feynman settled into his first professorship, trying to recover the pure joy of physics that had been somewhat eclipsed by the heavy burden of the war. The first months were difficult. He felt drained, a well that had run unexpectedly dry. He would stand in front of his class, delivering lectures on electromagnetism, but the old fire felt dim. Walking home across the campus in the fading light, he passed massive oaks and maples whose leaves were turning brown along the edges. He would pause on the stone bridge over Cascadilla Gorge and look down at the water tumbling over the dark rocks, a ceaseless motion that seemed to mock his own stillness. One day, he told himself aloud that he was completely burned out. But then, in the very moment of admitting it, a release occurred. He decided he would no longer try to do physics for greatness or reputation. He would do it only for play. He looked at the spinning water below and felt the lightness return to his chest, like a weight lifting into the twilight sky. The turning point came in the most ordinary of places, the university cafeteria. While eating lunch, he noticed a student playfully tossing a plate into the air. The plate wobbled as it spun, and the red medallion on the plate rotated in a strange, complex pattern. Idly, Feynman began to work out the equations for the wobble and the spin, relating the two motions to each other. He did this with no purpose whatsoever, purely for the pleasure of a beautiful relationship. He scribbled on a napkin, his sandwich forgotten, the noise of the cafeteria fading into a distant hum. This simple, joyful calculation led him down a path of thought that would eventually, years later, contribute to his work in quantum electrodynamics, work that won him the Nobel Prize. The lesson of the spinning plate stayed with him forever. The most profound discoveries often come not from straining toward a goal, but from peaceful play. When the time came to leave Cornell, the promise of a new landscape called to him. The California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, offered him a position in Pasadena, and he accepted with the eagerness of a bird sensing a southern wind. The journey across the country was a transition from the deep green of the Northeast to the warm, golden tones of Southern California. When he arrived, the light struck him first, a brilliant, clear sunshine that seemed to declare every day a holiday. The campus of Caltech was a serene arrangement of Spanish-style buildings with red tile roofs, arcades, and fountains that made soft, bubbling music in the courtyards. Palm trees lined the walkways, their fronds rustling dryly in the warm breeze that blew down from the San Gabriel Mountains. It was a place designed for thought to wander and for conversations to unfold at a gentle pace beneath a cloudless sky. Feynman's office at Caltech looked out over a lush central lawn where students lay reading or talking, their bodies stretched out on the grass. The room itself was comfortably cluttered, filled with books stacked in precarious towers, papers covered in diagrams, and small toys that served as objects of physics demonstration. On his blackboard, which occupied nearly an entire wall, he would draw the famous Feynman diagrams, simple, elegant pictures of lines and squiggles that represented particles moving through space and time. He worked often with the windows open, allowing the scent of orange blossoms from nearby trees to drift in. The sound of a distant fountain, the occasional chime of the campus clock tower, the soft scratching of his chalk, these were the rhythms of his daily life. Here, in this sun-drenched haven, his teaching and thinking blossomed with a renewed vigor that would mark the remainder of his career. One of the most distinctive features of Feynman's life in Pasadena was his friendship with the owner of a local bar and the time he spent playing the bongos. In the evenings, after a day of unraveling the secrets of the universe, he would sometimes go to a small, dimly lit club where he could drum on a set of borrowed instruments. The music was not an escape from physics, but an extension of it, the same patterns, the same rhythms of nature, translated into the beat of skin against skin. He would sit on a stool with the drums between his knees, his hands moving in a flurry of precise, joyful motion. The few patrons would watch this unlikely professor, his tie loosened and his eyes half-closed in concentration, transform into a musician. Outside, the street was quiet under a canopy of stars, the California night warm and soft as velvet. Feynman's home was a modest house in the hills, surrounded by chaparral and the twisted forms of ancient live oaks. The road that led to his door was narrow and winding, lined with wildflowers in the spring, golden poppies, and purple lupins that nodded in the ocean breeze. Inside, the house was full of light that poured through large windows, illuminating the simple furniture and the many shelves of books. In the living room, he kept an easel and paints, for he had taken up drawing as another form of play. His models were often the female students and friends who sat patiently for him in the dappled afternoon light, their forms rendered in careful, amateur lines. He approached art the same way he approached physics, with curiosity, humility, and a complete willingness to make mistakes. The quiet scratch of his pencil on paper was another kind of music, another way of paying attention to the beauty of the world. Southern California offered him landscapes of immense, open beauty that he explored on long drives. He loved to follow the Pacific Coast Highway north, where the Santa Monica Mountains plunged directly into the sea. The ocean here was a deep, glittering blue, meeting a shoreline of rocky coves and pale sand. He would park his car at a turnout and simply sit and watch the pelicans glide effortlessly over the waves, their wingtips almost touching the water. The sun would set into the Pacific in a great, slow blaze of gold and crimson, the clouds lit from below as if the world were a stained glass window. In these moments of solitude, facing the immensity of the ocean, the equations of quantum physics never felt far away. They were, after all, the description of the very light that danced on the water, the waves that broke against the shore. The universe was a single, unified poem, and he was a reader who could never put the book down. The lecture hall was a large, tiered room with wooden seats worn smooth by decades of restless students. Large windows along the upper walls let in a steady, diffused light that fell gently across the blackboard at the front. This was where Richard Feynman performed not a show, but a quiet act of translation, turning the dense, mathematical language of the universe into something a young mind could hold and examine like a smooth stone from a river. When he entered, carrying nothing but a few sheets of notes and a piece of chalk, the room would gradually hush. He stood for a moment, collected his thoughts, and then began to speak in a voice that was warm, unhurried, and full of a genuine delight. He was not there to impress. He was there to share something he loved, as a friend might share a beautiful view from a mountaintop. The famous Feynman lectures on physics, delivered during the early 1960s at Caltech, were a landmark in the history of education. To prepare, Feynman would spend hours in his office, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, filling the blackboard with trial explanations. He would erase and rewrite, searching for the clearest path through the forest. His goal was not to give students formulas to memorize, but to reveal the deep, simple structures that lay beneath the complexity. He wanted them to see that physics was not a pile of disjointed facts, but a continuous story, like the story of a river flowing from its mountain source down to the sea. On the days of the lectures, he would stand at the board, drawing careful diagrams, a little ball rolling down a slope, a wave oscillating on a string, and the students would lean forward in their seats, drawn into the narrative. Outside the lecture hall, the campus settled into its quiet afternoon routine. The sound of the bell in the clock tower drifted across the olive trees, and the shadows of the arcades grew long. Inside, the only sounds were the soft tapping of chalk, the murmur of Feynman's voice, and the occasional turning of a notebook page. He had a remarkable ability to make abstract ideas tangible. When explaining atoms, he would describe them as a crowd of tiny people, always moving, always dancing, and the students could almost see them jostling in the air before their eyes. He spoke about conservation of energy as if it were a strict accountant, never losing a cent. These homely images, delivered in his gentle New York accent, stripped away the intimidation of advanced science and left behind only curiosity and wonder. The air in the room felt electric not with stress, but with the quiet thrill of understanding. Feynman's insistence on true understanding over rote learning became a quiet revolution in pedagogy. He had no patience for jargon or obscurity. In a famous meeting with textbook publishers, he sat through presentations of new science books, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper. Finally, he pushed the books aside and said, "They missed it. They don't understand what science is about." He pointed out that the books used special vocabulary to describe simple things, energy makes it go, without ever explaining what energy is or how the process works. For him, teaching was a moral act, and unkindness to a student's mind was as bad as any other unkindness. This philosophy bled into every interaction. A student could stop him in the hallway, under the dappled shade of a plane tree, and he would pause without hurry, listening intently to their confusion, and then craft an explanation on the spot, his hands moving in the air to draw invisible pictures. The famous Feynman problem-solving method was another gift he gave freely. He would teach his students to write down the problem clearly, then think very hard, then write the answer. It was a joke, but with a profound core. The thinking was the sacred part. He encouraged them to take long walks, to lie on the grass and stare at the clouds, to let their minds play with the problem in a relaxed way. He recalled how he had solved many of his own hardest puzzles not at the desk, but while drifting in a sensory deprivation tank or sitting in a quiet corner of a jazz club. The campus gardens at Caltech, with their rose beds and small, turtle-filled ponds, became extensions of his classroom. He would sometimes meet students there, and they would speak quietly while watching the golden carp move lazily beneath the lily pads. Learning, in Feynman's world, was not separate from life. It was simply paying a deeper form of attention to the life you were already living. One evening each spring, when the jacaranda trees were heavy with purple blossoms, Feynman would give a public lecture intended for the wider community, not just physicists. The hall would fill with townspeople, children, and retired couples, all sitting together under the high, arched ceiling. The lights would dim slightly, and a single lamp illuminated the demonstration table. He would perform simple experiments, a flame dancing to sound, a pendulum tracing beautiful Lysage's figures in sand, and he would explain them with such clarity and joy that the audience felt they had been let in on a wonderful secret. The children would laugh at his jokes, and the adults would nod slowly, suddenly understanding something they had wondered about for years. Outside, after the lecture, the stars were bright overhead, and families would walk to their cars talking about the strange and beautiful behavior of water or the reason the sky is blue. It was teaching as gift-giving, and the gift kept resonating in the night air. In the quiet of his study, late at night after the lectures were done, Feynman would reflect on what it meant to truly understand something. He believed that if you couldn't explain a concept to a beginner, you didn't really understand it yourself. This rule kept him humble and perpetually learning. He would sit by a small lamp, the rest of the house dark, and work through his own explanations in a notebook, testing their simplicity. The cat, a quiet creature named for a physicist, would curl up on the windowsill, watching the moths bat against the screen. The world outside was still and peaceful, the occasional car passing like a distant thought. In these hours of solitude, surrounded by shelves of books and the scent of old paper, he was not a great scientist, but a perpetual student, still filled with the same wonder he had felt as a boy on the beach at Far Rockaway. The chalk dust on his fingers was the same fine sand, the love of learning the same open sea. The final years of Richard Feynman's life were lived in the same spirit of curiosity and gentle mischief that had marked his youth. The house in Altadena, a short drive from Caltech, was tucked against the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. The garden was a wild, comfortable tangle of native plants, sage, manzanita, and the pale green branches of the California buckwheat. From his porch, he could look out across the San Gabriel Valley, which on clear mornings lay under a soft blanket of marine haze that slowly burned away to reveal the grid of streets and the dark line of the Pacific horizon in the far distance. His health was declining, a slow battle with a rare cancer that he met not with despair, but with the same analytical eye he had turned on everything else in life. He would sit for hours in a wicker chair on that porch, a notebook on his knee, watching the hummingbirds dart around the feeder, their tiny wings a blur of impossible motion, and he would think. The last great public act of his career came in a freezing winter in Washington, D.C., when he was asked to serve on the commission investigating the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. The country was in shock, and the inquiry was mired in bureaucratic obfuscation. Feynman, already ill, flew to the Capitol and sat through hours of testimony in sterile, windowless rooms. The atmosphere was heavy and gray, but in a moment that would become legendary, he cut through the fog with a simple, direct experiment. During a televised hearing, he asked for a glass of ice water. The cameras rolled. The room was silent except for the clink of the glass. He took a small piece of the O-ring material from the shuttle's booster rocket and clamped it with a small C-clamp. Then he dipped it into the ice water. When he removed it, the material remained stiff and did not spring back. He showed, for all the world to see, that at freezing temperatures the seal had lost its resilience. It was a quiet, devastating demonstration, science made plain as morning light. He did not shout, he simply showed the truth. When he returned to California, the brief burst of public activity subsided, and he settled deeper into the quiet rhythm of his days. His friends came to visit, bringing soups and stories. They would sit in the living room, where the afternoon sun fell across the floor in long, amber rectangles. The conversations were soft and sprinkled with long, comfortable silences. He was still drumming, sometimes just tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair, a syncopated pattern that spoke of a mind that would not stop playing. Outside, the seasons rolled gently through the garden, the brief, fierce bloom of the cactus in spring, the dry rustle of seed pods in summer, the mild, rainy days of winter. He observed these changes with a naturalist's care, noting the first appearance of a new flower or the particular way the light slanted on the November afternoons. The universe had always been his real home, and he was still exploring its rooms. In his last months, Feynman spent much of his time in a small, sunlit room that looked out onto the garden. A hospital bed had been moved in, but he treated it more as a reading nook than a sickbed. The walls were covered with some of his own paintings, bright landscapes of deserts and oceans that he had created over the years, and a few photographs of Arlene, the young wife he had lost so long ago. A shelf held a model of a Challenger O-ring and the simple C-clamp he had used, the tools of truth now resting quietly. He would read, or close his eyes and listen to classical music playing softly from a small radio on the nightstand. The music, the light, the gentle sounds of birds outside, everything converged into a deep, abiding peace. He told one visitor that he was not afraid of death because he would not exist. It was the same state as before he was born, and he had not minded that at all. The logic was simple, and it gave him a kind of comfort. On February 15th, 1988, the day was mild and bright, the sky a pale winter blue typical of Southern California. In the garden, the rosemary bush was just beginning to show its tiny lavender flowers. Inside the house, the light moved slowly across the floor as it had done for many years, chasing the shadows from one corner to the next. Richard Feynman's breathing became shallow, and then, very softly, it stopped. There was no drama, no great pronouncement. The quiet of the room deepened by a single degree. Outside, a hummingbird paused at the feeder, its throat iridescent in the sun, and then darted away. The world continued in its patient habit, the hills standing as they always had, the equations still humming silently beneath the surface of things. The legacy he left behind was not one of loud proclamations, but of 1,000 quiet gifts. Students who had sat in his lectures now carried his joy into their own classrooms. The Feynman diagrams were drawn by physicists in every corner of the globe, a visual language of the subatomic world that remains as fundamental as musical notation. The transcripts of his lectures, bound in red covers, sat on shelves in quiet libraries, waiting for the next curious mind. But perhaps more lasting than any single achievement was the example of his way of being in the world, the constant questioning, the willingness to be simple, the delight in a spinning plate or a stretching O-ring. He had shown that the life of the mind could be a life of profound, playful peace. When the sun finally set on that February day, the sky above the San Gabriel Mountains was painted in soft shades of rose and gold, a gentle display of the same physics of light scattering that he had so beautifully explained to countless students. The earth turned slowly into shadow, and the first stars appeared, those distant points of fusion whose inner workings he understood as intimately as most men know their own backyards. In the garden of his Altadena house, the air grew cool, the scent of sage rising from the heated ground. One could imagine him there still, sitting quietly on the porch, looking out at the darkening valley, his hands still, the universe finally revealed in all its silent, exquisite coherence. The story of Richard Feynman closes not with an ending, but with a vast, quiet openness and invitation, left behind like a note on a chalkboard, for the rest of us to stay curious, to notice the beauty, and to always follow the question wherever it gently leads.